Utopias Price, Humanity Reborn. By Elton Gar. Curt took a deep breath and tried to open his eyes. The world remained dark, and he felt the IV in the back of his hand. He tried to remember where he was. After a few seconds, it came back to him. He had volunteered for a trip on a starship. He was about to go on a trip to a new world with real freedom. But the trip would take almost 3,000 years. That wasn't quite right. He had already taken the trip, and it had been 3,000 years. He hadn't thought that would bother him. But as he lay there, life slowly returning to his body, he felt the weight of the time. Everyone he had ever known was dead, and that was just the beginning. He couldn't even be sure if humanity had survived. That was, after all, part of the reason the ship had been sent across the stars. They were a backup plan to keep humanity alive. And he was among the first to be woken. He would help land the ship next to the great temperate gulf they had picked out, assuming that after thousands of years it was still the ideal location. As he thought of that, he coughed lightly and found a small plastic tube against his lips. He sucked on it, and a small sip of water filled his mouth. It was cool, but it was also bitter, and he fell asleep again. The next time he woke, there was a beeping. He lifted his hand and found cloth wrapped around his eyes. He pulled it slowly, and the light flooded over him. It was blinding, but so long as he held his eyes tightly shut, he could stand it. He pushed himself up until he was sitting, his legs dangling dangerously over the edge of the bed. Still blinded, he heard the voice of the autodoc telling him to remain in bed. He didn't need that warning. He was fairly certain if he tried to stand, he'd fall, and he was still blind. So he said,
"What is that beeping?"
His voice cracked as he spoke, and he felt the plastic tube pushed against his mouth again. He took another sip, but he spit out the bitter-tasting water. He didn't want to fall asleep yet.
There is someone trying to contact the ship. I have sent them a message, telling them that the crew of the ship is being revived.
How?
Curt asked. This was supposed to be an empty world.
They have not said, but the language is a variant of English, so presumably they are human.
How is that possible?
Curt asked. They had been assured anything significantly faster than their ship was impossible.
I am not designed to make assumptions of that type. Would you like to speak to them?
Okay,
Curt said. After a few seconds, a woman's voice said,
"Is this the ship in orbit?"
The voice had the stilted sound of one being translated by the ship's computer.
it is. We are a colony ship.
Curt said.
Are you from before the breaking? I did not expect you, and I see no signs of faster than light travel.
We took 3,000 years to get here. How did you get here?
Curt asked. His entire body hurt and his voice was ragged, but he pushed himself.
We have changed much since the breaking. We are able to move great distances instantly, though it is also costly to society, so done rarely,
The woman said. Curt didn't ask any questions, but he thought it through. Humans had at some point learned to travel faster than light. But because of the costs, each world was effectively alone, assuming he was interpreting this right. More importantly, that meant they couldn't or wouldn't just send him and the colony ship to an empty world.
Is your world crowded?
It is a large world, and there are only 2 billion of us. There are several large islands you could use.
Curt had seen several of the islands. They had been considered, but it had been decided that a continental location would be safer if there was a technological collapse. But he was also focused on the 2 billion people. He had assumed this was a colony world, and it was in one sense, but it had been thousands of years since they left Earth, so it could have been thousands of years since the people of this world had arrived here.
I am tired.
Curt said.
We will prepare for you.
The woman said. Curt slept most of the time over the next few days. He lost track of time, as every time he woke, he found the tube in his mouth. The water became less bitter over time, and he stayed awake longer, but he was still exhausted. The blinding light became less painful as well, and soon his world came into view. It was a sterile white room with a few robotic arms and several computers. There was a computer terminal that could be adjusted so he could see it while laying on his back. At first, he was too exhausted to even care about the computer screen. He just focused on the water and answering the questions the computer asked about his health. He even began to wonder if the message earlier had been a dream, and he had almost convinced himself of that when the computer said,
"There is someone from the surface attempting to contact you."
It took Curt almost a minute to decide that this wasn't a dream. He then said,
There has to be someone else.
There is not. Your early movement may have slowed your recovery, but you are more awake than the others. She also asked for the person she spoke to before.
Give me a few seconds.
Curt said, and he rubbed some cold water on his face and pulled back his hair. This could be an important conversation. After a few seconds, the screen changed to show a person. It took his eyes a second to focus, and then he saw her. She didn't look human, at least not entirely. Her eyes were almost twice the size they should be, and her face more round. Her skin had a green tint, and her smile was too wide.
You're not human.
Curt said, the words out before he realized just how undiplomatic it was.
I am human. But after the breaking, we adapted. And we were more adapted to this world. I understand the changes could be disturbing to you, just as your appearance is disturbing to me. A reminder of the rough form we used to have and the slow healing process. But over time, we will help you become more like us.
He didn't like the implications that they would be forced to alter their genetics, but there was nothing to be done about it now, so he allowed his eyes to slide shut. Her voice was still human, and so he said,
You called me.
I have found a suitable location for your ship. The island is roughly the size of New Zealand on Earth, with a comfortable climate and a largely isolated biosphere. I have given your computer the coordinates.
I'm not sure I'm the one who should decide.
Curt said.
You were first.
The woman said, and she sounded a bit confused. Curt didn't understand, but he knew that going somewhere else would take hundreds or thousands of more years, and things had already changed too much.
Have the ship land,
he said. Stepping out of the ship for the first time felt monumental. The people on Berellia hadn't been wrong about the spot. It was a vast valley with mountains on 3 sides and a gulf on the 4th. They were assured that would protect them from almost all weather, and there were no large predators on the island, so they were as safe as could be expected. That was good, because for now Curt was almost entirely alone. A few of the other people were aware enough to be tracking him, but if something happened, they'd be lucky to give any assistance. As Curt descended from the ship's ramp, he was greeted by the sight of a landscape that seemed both familiar and alien. The air had a freshness to it, different from the recycled atmosphere of the ship. The sky was a rich blue, unfiltered by the artificial lighting within the vessel. Birds, unlike any he had ever seen, soared overhead with colorful wings that reflected the vibrant hues of the Berellian flora. A soft breeze rustled the leaves of alien trees, their branches swaying gently. Despite the different vegetation, the overall ambiance felt strangely comforting. The terrain beneath Curt's feet was solid but yielding, as if the very ground welcomed their arrival. He set out a few of the tools that had been brought. They were used to survey the soil and the land. Then he set up the communications. In orbit, it had been easy, but here they needed to connect to the satellites they had put in orbit. The other people on the world had their own satellites, but it would take time to integrate everything. Still, once he set up the briefcase satellite dish, he sat down on a rock and called Hellion. He still wasn't sure why he had become the spokesperson for the ship. All Hellion would say was,
You were first.
When she asked to speak to him.
How are you finding your island?
The woman said. He considered making a joke. It had been easy to find. It was a large island, but jokes didn't always work in translation, so he said,
It is everything I had hoped for. Once we set up some of the automated fishing and farming, we'll begin to wake people up more quickly.
You should not use automated fishing.
Hellion said.
And why not?
The dolphins dislike it. If you must kill fish, please do so in rivers and lakes.
Dolphins?
Curt asked.
There are approximately 250 million in the oceans of this world.
Hellion said.
That will slow things considerably.
Curt said.
We have technologies for food if you wish. That way you would not be forced to murder any animals.
Hellion said. She seemed pleased with the idea, though Curt didn't like the idea of being reliant on them. Still not sure he should be the one to make the decisions, Curt considered telling her to wait. But without the ability to fish, that would be a long wait, so he said.
What do you eat if you don't eat meat?
We eat meat. It is grown in factories.
The woman said.
That sounds disgusting.
Curt said, imagining huge vats of bubbling liquids with pieces of meat growing in it.
It sounds more disgusting to eat something grown in a factory than to kill something with a brain and a life, then cut off parts you don't use and throw them away. I do not understand. We believed the savagery of the time before the collapse was because people had no choice.
Hellion said.
What savagery? We're just talking about eating some fish or cows.
Curt said. He had seen no signs that she was Hindu, but he realized that the cows probably were a bad idea, even though there were embryos for thousands of them on the ship, just ready to be grown and released. The green of the woman's skin grew darker, and Curt saw her trying to control herself. She then said,
It is not our way to question how others live.
I will try the meat you create. I cannot speak for others, but it seems easier. What do we need to give you for it?
Some of the disgust left the woman's huge eyes, and she said,
We would not ask for reciprocity. We trust each other to help when we can, and we understand you do not currently have the technology and infrastructure we do. All that is asked is that you attempt to limit your impact on the local ecosystems until you are more settled. As for the meat, we will arrange for regular deliveries, and the automated systems on your ship can be modified to accept and store the shipments properly.
Curt nodded. It was hard to be upset by the amount of help the people here were giving them. But with each interaction, it became more clear that the gap between these people and the humans that Curt knew was massive. He just hoped that they were telling the truth when they said they wouldn't force their will on the colonists, but it was beginning to feel a bit oppressive, at least compared to the freedom he had imagined. For the first few months, Curt kept busy almost constantly. The first few days were mostly setting up equipment. After that, the small group of people who had been woken first set up their homes. Those were large metal buildings that were somewhere between a large tent and a metal building. Large and permanent enough that they wouldn't have to use them, but very easy to set up. They had 20, one for each of the first colonists. And with solar cells, they could survive on their own and even protect themselves from each other. Once that was set up, Curt began to explore the countryside. The plan, so far as he knew, hadn't changed. There would be one large settlement built around the ship. They would slowly dismantle the ship to speed the growth of the city. But most people would live in communities of 100 or less people. This would make it harder for anyone to control them and help ensure survival if there were a disaster or fight. War had been assumed to be something that would be long in the future, but with people already here, Curt feared that the colonists would have to fight for their freedom sooner than later. And then, as he was sitting by the sea considering whether a field with large rocks and a steep cliff could be a suitable home, a tiny flying ship landed next to him. He had never seen Hellion in person, so when she stepped out, he was shocked by how tiny she was. She was barely more than 3 feet tall. But every sign was that this was not something unusual, but a natural state. The ship she was on, the others with her, the clothes and the way she stood told him she was of average height for her people.
You have contacted us less of late, so I have come to see how you are doing.
Hellion said.
I did not know it was expected. I have been busy. There are others who you can speak to.
But they are not first.
The woman said, sounding confused.
The first what?
Curt said.
The first to make contact with us. What other way would we decide who should be spoken to?
The woman said.
Speak Speak to the person who is most skilled or chosen by the people.
Curt said.
That speaks of a hierarchy. We do not indulge in such frivolities.
The woman said, sounding affronted. It was strange because Curt and most of the people on the ship had been chosen because they believed in personal freedom and claimed they didn't want anyone telling them what to do. Yet the idea of having no one in charge simply seemed wrong.
But you have factories and cities. You must have crime. I don't understand how you do any of that without someone to enforce things.
The woman looked at the other people with her and said,
We have factories and cities. The word crime did not translate correctly.
Crime is when someone acts in a way that is determined to be unacceptable by society.
Curt said.
Why would you do that?
The woman asked. Curt wasn't sure how to answer. So he began to think about everything that he knew about these people. They had freely explained that they had genetically altered themselves. He had just assumed that it was physical. But now he suspected it was far more than that. Humanity had been on a path to self-destruction, so they had fixed the problem. And as he looked at the young woman who had come all this way just to see how they were doing with no sign of trying to control him, he thought for the first time since he had arrived here that he understood. The people of this world were no threat to him or anyone else. He wasn't sure they could be. This tiny woman had approached a person who, from their point of view, was a savage and a giant with no one to defend her and no weapons, and showed no signs of even understanding there was a danger. It was the colonists who were the threat. He was a danger to these people. Alone, he could likely convince them to do almost anything. And there were 100,000 people on that ship, all who understood things like greed, power, and hierarchy. And they would see what he did, eventually. This world was a paradise, and they were here to destroy it. Curt saw no other way it could happen. All he could hope was that other worlds would be more able to defend themselves than this one.
Author's note. If humans colonize other worlds, and assuming it is difficult to travel between them, we will have something that humans haven't had in a long time. Truly isolated groups big enough that divergent evolution can happen. Evolution is, of course, slow. Even 3,000 years is unlikely to have significant changes to humans in how it has happened in the past. But that way is unlikely to be the way it happens in the future. We are already pushing evolution in a way that is likely to be faster than it normally is. Parents who know they have dangerous genetic defects can use procedures to make it far less likely that is passed on to their children. And that's going to change things. But bigger changes are likely to happen. It will probably start with making people more healthy. If something can make a person more likely to have a heart attack, why not remove it? Why not have children without allergies or with better immune systems? And that doesn't even take into account social problems, space travel, or real genetic alterations, all which may happen. That is to say, if humans live on different worlds, they are likely to become entirely different species quickly, and it's all but guaranteed to happen, eventually. I don't know that it's a good thing or a bad thing. I know that a lot of people won't like the idea of being replaced or changed. But in the end, if humans are too self-destructive to survive, perhaps the best option is to turn that destructive urge into destroying the most dangerous parts of humanity. If you enjoyed this, you can sign up for my newsletter at www.ansci-fi.com or my Patreon at www.patreon.com/Elton. Thank you. Elton Gar.